Hello and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is Pennsylvania elk, and with us is Jeremy Banfield, an elk biologist with the Pennsylvania Game Commission's Deer and Elk section. Hello, Jeremy, and thank you for joining us today. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Game Commission.
Yep, absolutely. I'm originally from Western New York, so I am not a PA native. Sorry about that. I did 4 years in the military. That took me from Alaska to Virginia to Michigan. I went to Michigan State for my undergrad degree. Again, sorry to all the Pennsylvanians that are Penn State fans. I got an undergrad in fisheries and wildlife management, and then from there, I went to the University of Alberta and got my master's in ecology. My research there focused on mountain lion elk interactions, and then I got a job in the state of Montana with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which is synonymous to the Game Commission just for the state of Montana. My wife absolutely hated Montana, and so I started looking for other positions in 2013, and I have been here ever since.
And Pennsylvania is your favorite state of all the states you've been to, right?
Yes, absolutely. Everybody always says, "Why would you leave Montana to come to Pennsylvania?" But I don't agree with that. Like, north central part of the state is a wonderful place to live, and it has really become home. So yes, I am happy here.
And there's elk, right? So that's the important thing.
Absolutely.
So many people are fascinated by elk and they enjoy driving out to areas to view elk herds in the early morning. Eastern elk lived in Pennsylvania prior to European settlement. So why are elk such an important animal to Pennsylvania?
That is a good question. I think that elk tend to be the flagship species for a lot of other species along the way. And when I say that, what I mean is that elk are like things that we do for the environment, things that we do for the habitat for elk tend to benefit a whole myriad of other species. So we can improve habitat and put more grassland out there on the landscape for elk, and that also benefits grassland songbirds and turkey populations and white-tailed deer populations as well. So that's probably one of the biggest reasons. And then the second biggest reason is just that they are awe-inspiring, right? They are large mammals. I think that always attracts people when an animal is very large, and they just are really, really interesting. Something that you don't often see in the eastern United States that is changing a little bit, like more and more eastern US states have elk populations now, but Pennsylvania has had one for over 100 years now. So all of those things combined, I think, collectively make elk in Pennsylvania one of the best species.
Well, I agree with you. And I know our audience does because they're here to find out more.
So everybody, I am, again, the elk biologist with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I'm going to focus on three kind of main areas of elk management. First, we'll talk about the mission of the elk management program. We do have an elk management area that I will cover. And then the big three are the population, the habitat, and the people aspect of this. So that includes elk hunting, as well as some of the elk viewing opportunities that are common in particularly in the fall months. So again, in three big broad categories, any foundational part of wildlife management or any foundational concept of wildlife management includes the population. That's how many animals are out there on the landscape. So birth rates, death rates, all the stuff that goes into that movement up and down of a population. The habitat out there that supports that population, and then the people aspect of it. And that last one is arguably the most challenging part. We manage wildlife for people, right? So without people, there's no point in doing any kind of wildlife management. But people can impact the population through hunting. People can impact the population through habitat degradation. We can make changes to the habitat and expect changes in the population. So all of these things are intertwined, and they do influence each other. So in one sentence, the mission of our elk management program is to maintain population sustainability, population, habitat health, habitat, and social acceptance while maximizing recreational opportunity. That is the people part of this. Our elk management area is in the very north central part of the state, includes pieces of McKean, Potter, Tioga, Elk, Clearfield, Jefferson, Clinton, Center, and Lycoming, and that big one in the center, or I should say smaller one in the center, but completely enclosed, is Cameron County. So pieces of all those other counties, and then all of Cameron County. Actual boundaries for this is US 219 to the very west, US 6 to the north, PA 287 on the eastern side, a little bit of 220, and then Interstate 80 to the bottom. If you are a hunter, that is all of 2H and most of 2G. There's a slight disparity on the eastern end there between the boundary of 2G, which is US 15, and the boundary of the elk management area, which is again PA 287. Within the elk management area, there are 14 hunt zones. So elk is the only species that does not follow this traditional WMU wildlife management unit concept. So you see all the wildlife management units there, and then elk is specific in that it has 14 unique hunt zones. The reason we chose that as our elk management area is that it is greater than 70% public land. The orange there is state game lands owned and operated by the state or by the Game Commission. The green is state forests and state parks, so owned and operated by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, but all of those things are public land. The only part of the state that kind of rivals that amount of public land is that pukey green there, and that is the Allegheny National Forest. So that is federal property. We do get questions sometimes, you know, do we ever want to see elk in the ANF? And the answer there is probably not in the near future. Their mission is much more timber related, less wildlife. And so in the near future, I'll say that we have space to expand where we're currently at in our current elk management area. And there's no need to expand it into the Allegheny National Forest. Another reason we chose this as our elk management area is to avoid agriculture. So the pink area here is agricultural areas. Obviously, the southeastern part of the state has a heavy ag component to it. It is one thing to have 5 little floppy-eared whitetails in your cornfield. It is something totally different to have 5 elk in your cornfield. So the real motivation here is trying to keep those animals out of trouble, trying to keep them on public land. So how many elk do we have? This is probably the number one question that I get, and we'll break this down and look into how we actually do this. We do a aerial-based survey. So the aircraft that you see there is not the specific one that comes to Pennsylvania, but it is the same model. Double prop, overhead wing, so they can see out of the windows. But then more importantly, from the belly of the plane is a very sophisticated camera, and that's what you see on the right-hand side of the screen there. The camera is infrared, which means it sees heat, and it will also see daytime imagery, but most of the flying is done at night, and they're really relying on that heat signature to make those animals pop out. So one thing that I want to point out here as this video is playing is that these are actually all bulls. At this time of year, if you look in the upper left, you'll see the date. At this time of year, the bull's antlers are, they're not going to be in velvet, they're going to be hardened, so there's not any blood flow to them. They're not hot, but you can just barely see them on the top of their heads. And when they turn a certain way, they actually cast a shadow across the body of the elk. So you can determine that these are bulls, not cows. We do this survey during the winter months because all of the foliage is off of the trees. Those are actually, what you see there is conifer trees, so they are evergreen trees. But the point that I like to demonstrate here is that infrared still sees through those trees fairly well, and it'll see through, you know, deciduous trees that don't have any leaf cover on them very, very well. So the whole elk range is not surveyed. About a third of it is, and the reason for that is that this is the primary occupied area. So again, we look at that black outer boundary, that's the elk management area. The green there is the elk hunt zones that I talked about earlier, and then this kind of rectangular square, whatever it is our primarily occupied areas with elk. And so we could fly further, but the cost benefit ratio just starts to go down fairly significantly. The black lines there that you see are actually the flight paths of the aircraft, and each line is 500 meters apart. So they were basing out of Du Bois in this case. That's the Du Bois airport they keep flying back to. And basically they are flying back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. There's one camera operator, one pilot, and they're in communication with each other. But excuse me, I advanced too far there. Anytime that they see elk, they peel off of that kind of long linear transect, that straight flying, and then they do circles. And that's what you see is all those heavy circles there. What that actually translates into in terms of our elk population is we've been doing this past 3 years. So 2020, we started the aerial survey. We've continued it through 2022. And you see the point estimates there. Those are estimates. So 1339, 1480, 1304. There are not exactly 1304 elk from this past year. It is an estimate. And what's more important is those error bars, those bars going up and down around that point is really what is the most important thing. And so what I'm trying to do here is demonstrate that, over the past 3 years, the true population, the actual population of elk is fluctuated somewhere between, this 1,300 and probably 1,400 animals. So we're never going to know exactly how many elk are out there, but through the aerial survey, we're able to get an estimate of that, and then all of our management decisions are based on that. Okay, shifting into habitat. Elk are primarily grazers, and you could argue that they are more related to cattle than they are to deer. They are certainly a member of the deer family, but white-tailed deer tend to do a lot of browsing, so nibbling of buds and twigs and things like that, and elk tend to graze a lot more. Both species overlap, so elk will browse, deer will graze, but for the most part, elk are going to be after this open canopy, not woods, big grassland type environment. Species that they're specifically looking at is clover, bird's-foot trefoil, orchard grass, timothy, and fescue. Those are cool season grasses, and they provide the best forage for elk. Quick video here just to add some awe and shock value. This is a camera that we put on on elk that has a little itty bitty camera in it. I'm sorry, this is a collar that we put on an elk that has a little itty bitty camera in it. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there, you can see the box, and there's that small lens on it. You're actually looking at the back of the elk's chin under these circumstances. So you can see other elk there, and this is what grazing is, right? They're just grabbing vegetation and literally ripping it up. Along with that, I talked about, the importance of browse as well. It's secondary to grazing, but still important. Particularly during the winter months, as snow accumulates, the elk are going to dig some. They'll dig through that snow accumulation to a point, but at some point they're going to shift over to a browse-based diet. And then when we talk about browse, again, that's going to be the buds of young trees, and species that are preferred there are aspen, willow, dogwood, unfortunately autumn olive. And one thing to note here is that the trees have to be less than 6 feet. So all that overhead canopy, really mature forest, it has browse, but it's 30, 40 feet up in the air, and the elk can't actually get to it. So young regenerating forest is really the key when we talk about elk forage. Again, just a quick demonstration. This is browsing. She's just going along and literally just taking the ends of these little buds right off. And that, I believe, is a raspberry or blackberry bush. Last part of habitat is cover. So elk have to have somewhere to bed down and feel secure. The trade-off with cover is they want to be concealed enough that they feel comfortable, but they also want to be able to see out so they can see any approaching danger. And this animal, again, is just bedded down. She's literally chewing cud. One thing I should mention, I'll just throw this in there. Elk are ruminants. So again, similar to cattle, they are made to be out in open spaces, putting down a ton of forage, and then they go back, they regurgitate that, chew it up more, and then pass it through the digestive tract that way. And that's what this animal's doing, sitting here bedded down under cover. One other quick fun one here. So if I do this in a live setting, I always ask, what does everybody think is going on here? But I can't do that here, so I'll just fill it in. This is during September, and that should be a key, but that elk is literally hoovering up acorns in this case. So acorns do provide a forage source, like a food source. It's very transient. That's the only downside about it. It's a month out of the year, there's acorns on the ground, and then deer, bear, elk, everybody's just sucking them up, and so they tend to disappear pretty quick, but neat to see there. Okay, moving on into our hunting seasons. We do have an active hunting season. It is highly coveted. I'll get into that in a few minutes, but it's 3 separate seasons at the moment. So we have an archery season the latter part of September, a general season the first full week of November, and then a late season the first full week of January the following year. The best thing I can say about this is that each one of these is its own silo. So each season has its own application fee, its own drawing, and then its own bonus point structure. I should have said this earlier, but elk hunting is on a lottery. So you can't just go and buy a tag over the counter. You have to apply for it. And that's what that application fee is. It's basically $12 to apply. You could apply for 1, 2, or all 3 seasons, but you're going to be dinged with the application fee every time. And then again, your applications don't move between seasons. They are stuck to that individual season. Every year that you don't draw, so every year that you are unsuccessful, you gain 1 bonus point. And the bonus points act as a multiplier. And basically your name goes in the hat for as many bonus points as you have. If you have been putting in every single year since the beginning of elk hunting back in 2001, but we didn't start the bonus point program until 2003, you could have a maximum number of bonus points for the general season of 20, and then archery and late seasons didn't start until 2019. So maximum number of bonus points you could have there is 4. Again, that is the number of time your name is going to be put into the hat or into the pool, and that effectively bumps the probability that you're going to draw. So every year that you put in and you're unsuccessful, your odds of success go up a little bit the following year. I talked about the hunt zones earlier. So you'll see hunt zones on the very left there, 2 through 14. The one hunt zone that is missing is number 1. So hunt zone 1 is open to anybody with a valid tag. And the reason for that is that it kind of encompasses the outer bounds of the elk management area. And the goal there is to try and liberalize the harvest along the edge so that we're trying to keep those animals in. Every other zone has a specific bull and cow allocation. So antlered is obviously bulls, antlerless is cows. And then there's a certain tag allocation for each hunt zone and each season. The one exception there is hunt zone 7. Hunt zone 7 is the area right around the Elk Country Visitor Center. And, that's where everybody goes to view elk. And so we don't really want people shooting at elk while other people are simultaneously trying to watch them. You can imagine that would cause some problems. So that's why zone 7 doesn't have any tags allocated to it. But total this year, 60 bulls, 118 cows. All right. Who applies for this, or how many people apply for this? Quite a few. So 178 tags. This past year, we had 104,000 and change applications. Remember, that's applications, not applicants, because people can put in for 1, 2, or all 3 seasons. So the actual number of applicants was 56,000 and change. Again, I hear very often that your odds of pulling an elk tag are not good. That is true. I also hear that your odds of winning the lottery are better than pulling an elk tag. That is not true. It depends on what lottery we're talking about. But if you went to like Powerball or something, your odds are 1 in a million. Your odds of pulling an elk tag are certainly better than that. But it's coveted. I don't know what else to say. There are a limited number of tags. There's a lot of people that are interested in it. The one positive spin I could put on it is that it's $12, right? It's $12 to apply, so it's certainly not expensive to do so. Where are these people from? So 85% are Pennsylvania residents. That's not surprising. But I show this map just to demonstrate that the 15% of our non-resident applications, obviously most of them are neighboring states, but we do have one person from all 50 states, including Hawaii there, and not even the Big Island, that have applied to hunt elk in Pennsylvania. I think that's awesome. I think that's a testament to our elk program and the fact that it is known nationwide, at least by a few, and has nationwide interest in coming to Pennsylvania to pursue elk. So shifting away from the elk hunting aspect and jumping into elk viewing. I'm gonna take this into our Elk Smart program, and let me give you a little background on that first. So Benezet is in north central part of the state. It is a very small community of about 180 full-time residents. I think that's an exaggeration. I pulled that off of Google. I've been to Benezet many times, and I swear there is not more than like 50 people that live there full-time. But 50 people, 100 people, 180 people, not very many people live in the town of Benezet. Every year, about 500,000 people visit that area. The vast majority of those people are during September and October, so during the fall rut. That's when elk are active and bugling. It's really, really an amazing, magical time to visit that area. And these numbers are from a traffic counter that sits on the driveway of the visitor center, so it's not made up. That's actual data from that area. You can imagine when we have 500,000 people, about 500,000 people, flooding into an area that has 180 full-time residents, small community, and again, in a very short window in terms of time, it tends to cause things like this, right? So tremendous traffic congestion, people getting angry about that and frustrated. The local people get extremely frustrated by it. We see what I would call risky behaviors by people. So elk are doing their thing, and the elk get very, very accustomed. I mean, when elk see 500,000 people come through on an annual basis, they're going to very quickly learn that people don't pose any threat to them, and so they'll become habituated to that presence. So we get situations like this. Trespassing on private property. That person does not own that house. They're standing in some random person's driveway, taking a picture of a bull way too close. Somebody's grandkid, right? Is that safe? Probably not. Another example here. So this was a few years ago, and you can witness what just happened there. Those bulls during the rut, September, October, are absolutely surging with testosterone. So they are just, trying to kill each other. And that car was obviously severely damaged. He did accidentally run over the back legs of that bull, so we did have to go and euthanize the bull the next day. But what I really like to show there is that imagine if that car, and I'll just do it one more time, if that car was people, outside of their vehicle, standing there watching those animals fight, they would just be absolutely bowled over and severely injured. So someday, at some point, something bad is going to happen in terms of human injury, and hopefully, nobody gets killed or anything like that. But that is leading into where I'm going with this. One final piece of this is the de-wilding aspect, and again, this comes down to the idea that we value elk and we love elk because they're wild, right? We want to keep them wild and keep some of that romantic cachet about them. When they're habituated, they tend to lose some of that. So in response to all of this, we started an Elk Smart program in 2020. Elk Smart is a singular unified message between all these different organizations. So our sister agency, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, PA Wilds, Keystone Elk Country Alliance, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and the Great Outdoors Visitors Bureau. And in one sentence, the mission of our elk program is to encourage those to create an elk country to be modern actions and help keep Pennsylvania's elk wild. There are 4 points, related to Elk Smart. And the first one is give elk space. And that is at least 100 yards is what we recommend. And that's just, I always tell people, like, look, you have a bubble, elk have a bubble as well. So elk definitely need space so that they can do their thing, and people can stay safe, the elk can stay safe. We always ask people to not feed elk. One, it is illegal. And then secondly, it is extremely dangerous and just leads to transmission of disease and things like that. So everybody's always well-meaning when they want to feed animals, and elk and bear in particular, but it never ends up having positive effects on the population itself. Don't name the elk. This one we always get a few raised eyebrows about. This again relates back to that idea of the de-wilding aspect. So, they're not pets. When we name our pets, elk are wild animals, and we do want to keep them wild. Like, we all have a responsibility to keep them wild for the next generation, for your kids, for your grandkids. And the second part of that is that, remember, this is a hunted population. So every year what seems to happen is some big bull will get a name, and then invariably that bull gets taken during the hunting season. And you can see, or I don't have to describe what kind of needless contention that causes. And then the last part of that is just do your part. And that's just, if you see something, or if you're seeing somebody behaving in a way that you think is risky or not following these other points, then say something, right? You have the absolute right to protect your elk population in saying something about that behavior. We got a bunch of swag associated with Elk Smart. So t-shirts are available, yard signs, things of that nature. We've got stickers as well. And we tend to push this message in the fall, obviously, during the viewing season, September, October. We always kick it off at our Elk Expo, which happened a couple weeks ago, back on the 20th of August. And so if you see these signs out there, that's what this is. It's the Elk Smart program. And again, we're just trying to help people recognize that they play a role in keeping our population as wild as we can. And that is all I had. So I think I kept it to about 25 minutes. I will take any questions related to any of that or anything outside of that that I may not have covered.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that information. The Elk Smart program is a really great way to remind the human population to respect the elk population.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's have you answer some questions. We'll start with, there's a couple questions about the biology of elk that we'll get to, but let's start with, how do biologists use research to understand how elk interact with their habitat?
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so I kind of stayed away from all the research stuff because I have a limited amount of time and I couldn't dive into it too much. But if we think back to kind of that interplay between the population and the habitat and people, we understand how those things relate to each other through research projects. So one specific example related to habitat more recently here would be we have what's called a forage preference project, and that sounds like a mouthful. We kind of couldn't think of a better name, but if you picture a field, right? So picture a football field for now, but like picture a field out in the woods. And then in that field, there are 12 different strips of unique different forages. So each strip is about 50 feet wide by 150 feet long. And it's a buffet, right? Basically, we are giving the elk a buffet of 12 different species of forage. And then each one has a telephone pole sitting on the strip and then a trail camera on it as well. And so we're basically measuring the amount of use that each one of those species of forage would get by the elk themselves. And the data point we're using there is the presence of the animals measured through a trail camera. And then we repeated that 4 times in 4 different areas. So there's 4 fields, each one has 12 strips in them, each one has a trail camera on them. And again, the idea there is that if we give elk this buffet, what are they going to select from that? What are they going to choose to eat from that? And the hope is that in 2, maybe 3 years, like 3 to 5 species would kind of float to the top. And then those are the ones that we'll put into a mix to improve our habitat effectiveness. So that's an example of a research project.
So a little more biology. How long do elk live and about how big is an elk?
Okay. Bulls on average in the wild Pennsylvania population are going to be around 10, maybe 11 years old. If a bull exceeds 11, they are old for sure. Cows is going to be a little bit older, more like the 15 to 16, 17 mark. Again, if you have a 20-year-old cow or like even a 19-year-old cow, that's definitely pretty old. So 10 would be the average on bulls, 15 would be the average on cows. For how big they are, bulls can be anywhere from 750 to 850 pounds, and then cows are more often in the 500 to 600 pound range. Sometimes you'll see like a 650 pound cow, but that's an absolute monster. Same thing for bulls. There are rare occasions where we can see a 900 pound bull, but those are rare for sure.
What other animals would be found in the same habitat as elk?
Ooh, that's a good one. All kinds of things. I talked earlier about kind of elk being the flagship species for habitat improvements, and all the changes that we make for elk habitat benefits all kinds of other species. So grassland songbirds would be one that comes to mind specifically. Turkey poults require that type of environment when they're growing. White-tailed deer benefit from grazing. Bears will use some of that habitat occasionally. Bears tend to favor the big woods a little bit more, but they do require that edge component as well. So, I mean, those are a few of the big ones that come to mind right off the bat.
Have you ever seen an elk fight with another animal than an elk?
That's an interesting one. No. Well, I take that back. I've seen an elk attack a car. Again, that happens during the rutting activities up there in the Benazet area. But I've never actually seen an elk attacking anything else. They will chase off deer if they kind of get into their bubble or something like that. But I've never seen one fighting or attacking another species.
So do or did in the past elk have any natural predators other than humans?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really good one. if we go back to pre-colonial times, elk were here in Pennsylvania, and colonial era came in, early 1800s. And at the time, they thought there was just, tons of game out there. And so there was this unregulated hunting and unregulated killing of wildlife, elk included. But back at that time, there was also a different suite of predators. So wolves, mountain lions, things like that were also present in Pennsylvania pre-colonial and early colonial years. And they would have been main predators. Since then, those species have been wiped out. Elk were actually extirpated from Pennsylvania as well in late 1800s, somewhere in that range. And then we reintroduced them in the early 1900s. Since then, main predators of elk are obviously going to be people, either directly through hunting or indirectly through automobile accidents, things like that. Black bears will predate or will prey on elk calves. So just on the young of the year. Coyotes will as well, but less so than black bears. Black bears are the main predator when we talk about calves. As soon as the animal makes it to about a year of age, though, there's not a whole lot of natural predators that would prey on an adult.
You mentioned the elk that we have are reintroduced species because of the extirpation. So are these kind of a combination of a Western elk and an Eastern elk, or what's the species of elk we currently have here?
Yeah. Okay, our population was extirpated, and I should explain that. That would be like a localized extinction. Elk were not extinct from the world or the United States, but they were in Pennsylvania, extinct from Pennsylvania, which the term we use there is extirpated. So like a localized or a geographically specific extinction would be the term extirpation. So elk were extirpated in Pennsylvania sometime around like 1860, 1870. Nobody really knows like when the last elk was killed, but they stopped being observed around that era and then stayed that way for about 40 years. 1913, elk were brought in from Yellowstone National Park. So those would be Rocky Mountain elk. However, the idea that there was Eastern elk and then Rocky Mountain elk in the past, I'll say, decade has really kind of gone away. So modern genetics have basically taken the concept of a subspecies and turned it on its head. I mean, genetically, they are identical animals. And so if there's any subtle differences that we see between them, it's generally due to the environment, not to their genetic makeup or their DNA. We still have a few kind of subspecies that we recognize in the United States. So Rocky Mountain elk would be one. Roosevelt elk would be another one that are out on the coast of Oregon, California. And then Thule elk are also in California as well. Again, all those animals are genetically identical, but they have little variations in their physical appearance because of the habitat that they occupy and how long they've been there. So anyway, our reintroduction came from the Western United States, but do we have, a mixture between Eastern elk and Rocky Mountain elk? No, I mean, an elk is an elk is an elk.
That's a good answer. So how did the habitat change? So when the Eastern elk were here and then they were extirpated and then elk were brought back into it, was there a change in the habitat for them?
Yep, that one is difficult to answer because we don't know what it looked like pre-colonial or really even in the colonial era. There is a lot of assumptions and I shouldn't say assumptions. There is some evidence that Native Americans were setting fires more frequently. And so maybe wildfire was ripping through the landscape a little more often than it does now. There wasn't modern fire suppression or anything like that. And that probably kept the landscape a little more open and more appealing for elk. A lot of the historical accounts that you read talk about elk being down on in river valleys and things like that. So using riparian areas. I think that's biased though, because rivers were the highways that we were using at that time, right? So the rivers were the travel corridors for people. So obviously that's where they're going to see elk. It's almost impossible to say what Pennsylvania looked like back then, but it probably didn't look exactly like what it does now. I would picture it a little more less mature woods, less mature forests, and a little more mosaic of different habitat types. So young grassland, young forest, and then also a mature forest component as well.
Well, speaking of forest and food, you mentioned that elk eat acorns. Is there a specific acorn that they prefer?
Probably white oaks over red oaks. I don't know if anybody can, again, definitively answer that. Deer seem to prefer white oaks over red oaks. And so I'll say elk are probably in that class as well. But no, we see elk eating acorns of all kinds of different species. So they'll eat both, but if they had to prefer one, I'm going to do an educated guess and say that it was white oaks over red oaks.
During your presentation, you mentioned that it was unfortunate that the elk feed on the autumn olive trees. Why is that?
Wow, somebody really,
Somebody was paying
paid attention to
attention.
that one. Because autumn olive is an invasive species. So it's good that they feed on that tree, but it doesn't really belong here. Like we actively try and remove autumn olive from game lands because it's an invasive species and tends to take over everything.
During the presentation, you also talked about the population and the expansion. The question is, how has the expansion eastward from Kettle Creek and surrounding area fared to this point? And are there particular towns or landmarks that the elk have notably reached?
Yeah, so if we were to talk about eastward expansion and kind of the current distribution of the elk population, when I first started 2013, about 10 years ago, Kettle Creek the Kettle Creek Valley would have been the most eastern edge of the elk range. Since then, it's continued to expand slowly, but still expanding. Now they're moving up East Fork toward Cherry Springs State Park, moving further east from Kettle Creek. Not like, don't think Lock Haven or anything, like not that far, but still there's this slow eastward expansion. Maybe 5 miles outside the Kettle Creek area, like to the east of Kettle Creek, and then further south as well. And that's good. Like that's within the elk management area. It's nice to see that expansion north and east. In terms of towns, like elk haven't reached Gailton yet. Elk haven't reached Bellefonte or anything like that yet. What else is over there? Renovo, I mean, like there are elk outside Renovo and to the east of there as well. So it's hard to draw a kind of a box, but again, a conservative estimate would be like 3 to 5 miles to the east of the Kettle Creek Valley.
Does the loss of trees, such as the loss of the eastern hemlock tree in the forest, affect the population or where the herds go?
It's probably going to have, I don't know if it's going to have an effect on the population. It's going to have an effect on habitat selection and habitat use. So hemlock trees are an evergreen tree. I don't know if I said it earlier, but evergreens are traditionally used for bedding cover. Like they're not going to feed on pine trees or hemlock trees, but they often use those areas to bed down and feel secure and use them for security cover. As those areas are lost, or if they end up being lost, they're going to have to shift over to some other type of habitat component. So is it going to impact the population? Probably not, but it's going to cause a shift in distribution and habitat selection.
Are there any invasive species or diseases that have specifically affected the elk population in Pennsylvania?
Ooh, two pieces there. Invasive species, I mean, Pennsylvania has lots of invasive species. Is there any that directly impact elk? Probably not, and not in a negative way. Technically, some of the fescue grasses that they consume regularly are invasive species, but it doesn't have a negative impact on it. Same with like autumn olive, it doesn't have a negative impact on them. For disease, though, that is very different. Eastern elk, not just Pennsylvania, but all the eastern states, do suffer from brain worm. So there is a small worm that goes into the brain of the animal. White-tailed deer actually carry it around all the time. It requires a gastropod, so a slug or a snail, to complete the life cycle. The eggs are actually shed through feces. They then have to be ingested by some slug or snail. And then the slug or snail has to be subsequently ingested by an elk or a deer, and that continues this life cycle. So elk do get brain worm. They are a little more susceptible to brain worm than deer are. It doesn't have a huge effect on the population. It's like 1 to 2% on an annual basis end up dying from brainworm. But it is something that like the Western elk populations, excuse me, the Eastern elk populations see compared to Western populations don't deal with that. They don't have the slugs or the snail populations that we do in the East because it's too dry. So yeah, that would be one. Second big one, and probably everybody knows this, is chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease is a fatal disease of deer and elk. It is in our deer population in the southern part of the state, and it is slowly but surely creeping up toward the elk range. So eventually, the pessimistic / realistic thing to say here is that elk are going to get CWD at some point, but when that happens is almost impossible to say. The one positive spin I can put on this is that elk have had elk populations in the western United States, Colorado, Wyoming, have had CWD for 40 some years, and it hasn't completely wiped out the population. So it's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with in Pennsylvania. Is it going to destroy the entire population? No. But are we going to have to change some of our management techniques? Probably.
So our last question is, well, there's multiple questions. It's all about the antlers. So could you fill us in on how big they get, at what age do they get them? Give us all the details on the antlers.
Okay, so 3 things that go into antler development are age, nutrition, and genetics. You have to have age and you have to have nutrition to unlock genetic potential. You can be in poor condition or a young animal, have the best genetics in the world. It doesn't matter. You've got to have, you've got to be mature and you've got to be in good health for that genetic potential to come out. If we think about whitetails, their antler development maximizes around like 5.5, 6.5 years of age. Everything for elk is pushed back. So 8, 9, 10 is going to be when antler potential is at its peak in terms of age. The nutrition in Pennsylvania is great. So like the habitat is good. As long as those animals have access to high quality forage, the antlers are going to grow very well. And then the genetic potential comes out through that. It's impossible to talk about genetic potential, like how the genetics actually influence it, because it's such a black box. But age is the one thing that we can kind of control. And so we have a very restricted harvest on our bulls that allows them to get to those mature age classes, the 8, 9, 10 years old. And that's where we really see the very large antlered bulls.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for your questions. If you want to explore more about this topic, visit the Pennsylvania Game Commission website or the State Museum of Pennsylvania website. The links are in the chat box. So Jeremy, what would you like the audience to remember about today's program about Pennsylvania elk?
I would just say thank you all so much for your attention. Thank you for being, conservation minded. The fact that you're here is a demonstration that you're obviously interested in elk and conservation and wild things in Pennsylvania. So keep that up. That's awesome. Pass that on to the next generation as well. And just continue asking questions and continue being interested in the outdoors.
Thank you, Jeremy, for being part of this program today. We hope the audience will join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit our website for more program information and to sign up.